Dexterity is probably the cheesiest stat to focus on. It seems like all the broken weapons have something to do with dexterity in some way, but it's also a really fun stat. And today we're going to go through 3 dexterity builds for you to try. Let's go. Let me know in the comments your favorite dexterity builds and what stat you would like me to do next. First, we'll start out with what I'm going to call the Black Blade. The Black Blade is about buffing your damage with incantations like Black Flame Blade or Blood Flame Blade to buff their Nagakiba. You don't have to use a Nagakiba, you can use some other weapon as long as it doesn't already have an additional effect like magic or fire damage, something like that, so that you can buff it with these incantations. Blood Flame Blade will increase your blood loss buildup with the Nagakiba so you can trigger that status effect more often, and the Lord of Blood's Exaltation Talisman will allow us to increase your damage even further when that blood loss effect is applied. Same goes for the White Mask, which we're wearing here as well. We can also combo this with something like Seppuku so that you can trigger blood loss on yourself to trigger this status effect. However, I originally was doing this but decided to switch to Double Slash because I preferred to have an Ash of War that was a bit more offensive orientated, as it's very easy to get that blood loss effect on enemies, and I wanted to have something a bit more aggressive rather than just the ability to stab myself when I'm just running the one weapon. You can also run Flame Grant Me Strength to increase your physical damage dealt, Golden Vow as well to increase your damage dealt. There's also the Black Flame's Protection to keep with that black kind of theme that we're going with here as well, if you wanted to go that route, and Scouring Black Flame, which will do an AoE attack in front of you and deal that Black Flame damage to enemies, as well as Black Flame Ritual. So lots of Black Flame skills and stuff in this build, really. Essentially, the goal of this build is to buff yourself and your single weapon, the Nagakiba being the katana with the longest reach, as much as possible, and then just melting down enemies with this build is kind of the main goal here, really. And it's a fun build to play if you just want to focus on a single katana setup. And because of the faith that you do have for this build as well, you can then, spec into other incantations. If you don't like the incantations that we're using here, you can go into really any kind of direction here, really. The primary stats for this build is dexterity, obviously, and faith. You will need a bit of faith for using all of these different spells, at least around the 42 mark, so you can use all of the different spells that we are using. I'm using the Nagakiba as mentioned and the Godslayer's Seal. You can use a shield with this build in your offhand if you really wanted to. However, I wouldn't recommend it. You may as well just keep the seal in your second hand, and when you're not using any incantations, you can two-hand the Nagakiba. For talismans, I'm using the Green Tonal Talisman to increase my stamina recovery. The Lord of Blood's Exaltation, so blood loss in vicinity increases my attack power. The Rotten Winged Sword Insignia to increase my damage on consecutive hits. And I'm using the Great Shield Talisman as well to improve my physical damage negation. However, you can switch this out to anything you like if you do prefer to use something else. However, because this build doesn't really have any defenses, having that extra physical negation does help in the long run. Next up, we have the Poison Samurai. Now, I made a whole video on the Poison Samurai, so go check that out if you want to really get into the nitty-gritty of this build. But this build focuses on dual-wielding weapons to apply status effects, namely the Poison status effect as well as blood loss simultaneously. When Poison is triggered, you get that damage increase from the Kindred of Rot Exaltation and the Mushroom Hat to increase your attack power, as well as Lord of Blood's Exaltation for when you trigger blood loss to increase your attack power even further. And we can trigger these effects with some of the Ash of Wars that we're using. And you've also got the Rotten Wind Insignia to increase your damage even further just for dealing different attacks. So really, this build is all about buffing your attack power and triggering status effects. Now, for this build, I use dual Uchi Katanas. However, you can use the Scavenger Curse Swords if you do have both of them, like in New Game Plus, because you can get one per playthrough. So you can then level these up and use these instead. However, I'm personally using the Uchi Katanas, but you can go that other route. Now, for the Ashes of War for this build, the Seppuku skill is perfect to use here because you can then stab yourself, get that blood loss increase to yourself, as well as the damage increase you get from just using the skill itself. And the other skill is the Poison Moth Flight on the main weapon. You want to have this on your main weapon because this is the one you'll use in combat mostly. Now, if the target doesn't already have poison applied, it will add to their poison buildup and do damage. If they do have poison, it will explode the poison and deal damage to them, kind of like as if it's triggering blood loss, but it's triggering like the poison, and then you can actually apply poison to them again after that. So you can just keep reapplying the poison status in that way and just keep increasing your attack power and cycling through the different status effects, like exploding on the target to just deal heaps of damage. It works really, really well, and I really like this build. Your main stat for this build is just dexterity. However, you should put some points into strength just to help with your scaling so you can get that extra bit of juice out of your your damage. Your secondary stats really here is vigor and endurance. You don't necessarily need any mind for this build, but you will need some vigor and endurance, especially endurance, because you're just going to be swinging for days. Now, as mentioned, I'm using dual Uchikatanas. However, you can switch to like a Nagakiba if you don't have two Uchikatanas, or you can use the Scavenger Curse Sword. The main focus is having two weapons that have blood loss build up on them already, and then when you apply the two Ashes of War, Seppuku, and Poison Mothflight, you can set them both to poison so that they both do poison build up and blood loss build up, so you get both of those effects applying. For my armor, you can just wear whatever, but I am wearing the mushroom hat, so every time poison is applied, it increases your attack power further. You absolutely need to wear this crazy hat. For your talismans, Lord of Blood's Exaltation and the Kindred of Rot Exaltation will increase your damage for blood loss and poison build up respectively. The Rotten Winged Sword insignia to greatly raise attack power with successive attack. I also am a fan of Godswing Swaddling Cloth for this build, so successive attacks restore HP. However, if you do have Millicent's Prosthetic, which will boost your dexterity and raises the attack power with successive attacks as well, use that instead. However, you have to do Millicent's questline in a certain way to get it, and I did it the other way. The last build on this list is something you probably have guessed already, and it revolves around a particular katana that everybody loves, and that is the Rivers of Blood katana. This is like a samurai build that simply focuses on how powerful the Ash of War on this weapon is, the Corpse Piler. This is like you're going to be your primary attack. Now, the Rivers of Blood katana itself does physical and fire damage as well as blood loss buildup, so it does all of those statuses, which is just fantastic. We're going to wear the white mask here to increase your damage overall when you do have blood loss applied, and this build also uses Flame Grant Me Strength to increase your physical and fire damage, which are the two main types of damage you do here. So really, you're just focusing simply on that Ash of War and buffing it as many ways as possible. Now, you can dual wield Rivers of Blood katanas in New Game Plus like I'm doing in this footage, but you don't have to. You could just rock one and two-hand it, or even just have like an Uchikatana or the Nagakiba or something in your offhand if you wanted to go the dual wielding route. But realistically, just having that Rivers of Blood katana, leveling it up and using that as your primary weapon is the main focus of this build, and it just melts enemies. It can be a little bit tricky sometimes to time it right to get it off, but you will figure out the timing. You kind of have to start the attack animations before they get to you and hope that you have enough poise to kind of go through their attacks. And in some cases, if they block or you do get staggered, it does ruin your flow and it makes it a little bit hard with this build. You might have to actually use just some of the generic attacks, but as long as you can just focus on using the Corpse Piler, you are going to see great success. Your stats for this build are Dexterity and Arcane. You want to level them almost simultaneously because of how well the Rivers of Blood stacks with Dexterity and Arcane together. Your secondary stats are Vigor, Endurance, and Mind. You probably want to have more Vigor and Endurance, but you will need a bit of Mind because we're using Corpse Piler so much. You want to have a little bit of that. You will also need 15 Faith, so you can use Flame Grant Me Strength for this build, but that's a pretty small investment when you're like at the end of the game. So we are using the Rivers of Blood weapon as mentioned, and I'm using the Dragon Communal Seal because it stacks with Arcane and has very low actual requirements in order to use, so we are using that. Any armor that allows you to medium roll is really important for this build, and having a decent amount of poise as well, so you can take some hits while using Corpse Piler, so make sure you get that poise above the 56-ish mark. For your talismans, we're using the Lord of Blood's Exaltation and the Rotten Winged Sword insignia. Again, both of these are great. Carrion Philogene Crest will reduce the cost of Corpse Piler every time you use it, and Shard of Alexander to maximize the damage output for Corpse Piler. Check out my intelligence builds. That goes through 3 intelligence builds to try as well. Thank you for watching this video till the end. Thank you to our members for supporting the channel. My name is Norza, and I hope you have a great day.